Chapter 1 of The Adventures of Tommy Blake. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Therese. The Adventures of Tommy Blake by Brother Ernest Ryan, CSC. Chapter 1. The Flight. Astor Street, number 429. Here is the place, madam. The cab came to an abrupt stop in front of a very small, one-story cottage, packed suffocatingly between two houses much larger but every bit as dirty. It was evident that this was now a very poor quarter of the city, though some of the dwellings seemed still to indicate that at one time they had been the homes of well-to-do citizens. "I'm sorry I have no tip for you, my good man," said Mrs. Blake, as the driver set down three very heavy suitcases upon the floor of what should be called the reception room. "That's perfectly all right. I'm paid a salary. I hope you'll like your new home." Bowing his head in a friendly fashion, the driver departed, leaving Mrs. Blake and Tommy to their thoughts. "This is certainly nothing like you have been used to, dear, but we will have to make it do at present." "Don't worry about me, Mother. I can stand it if you can." "You're a dear, Tommy." "How far away are we from Dad?" "About 100 miles." "He'll never come here, will he?" "No, not here." It was evident from Mrs. Blake's voice that she didn't feel any too certain that Thomas Blake Sr. would not find them. 14 years before, in spite of all warnings, Louise Bowman, a lovely Catholic girl, had married Thomas Blake, a wealthy atheist. Louise always said she was not marrying Tom for his money, but because she loved him, and she would add, as a sort of soothing syrup for her rather guilty conscience, "I know he'll come over after we are married." But for 14 years there had been no sign of conversion on Tom's part. Indeed, quite to the contrary. It was only because of the overwrought nerves of the mother that he had permitted Tommy to be baptized a Catholic. When it came time for the boy to go to school, another scene occurred, and not until Louise Blake took the child and returned to her mother's house, declaring that, unless he were educated as a Catholic, she would remain there in spite of gossip, did her husband yield. Things were never the same after that in the Blake household. Externally, life went on as usual, but Tom found more and more reasons for being away from home. His invariable claim was that business called him elsewhere, and to add to Louise's difficulties, her mother was now dead, so there was no place where she could go for comfort. "Louise, I must go to Florida in the morning. It would bore you to go along. Business, you know." "Can't you get someone else to go?" "No, Louise. I've found no one who can carry on my business for me." "How long will you be away, Tom?" "About a month, I believe." "A month?" gasped his wife. "Yes, a month." As Mrs. Blake went about inspecting the little four-room house that was now to be her and Tommy's home, her memory was busy with scenes like these. There had been many of them. Finally the break had come. For more than a year the wife had lived the life of a martyr. She could stand it no longer. In name only could she continue to be the wife of Tom Blake. She would take the boy, and what belongings it could carry, and quietly leave their house for some strange town at a distance. She had about $150 in cash. That would take her and Tommy far enough away and pay their rent and meals until she herself could begin earning. And so it came about that they were beginning their new life in this small, shabby house. Young Tom Blake was the picture of his mother. He was now 12 years old and ready to enter a junior high school. There was a very exclusive one in the city of his birth, and his father had declared that he must go to it in September. That had been one of his mother's chief worries before they left. Of course Tom missed his father. Dad had always treated him so well, had given him everything he wished. Moreover, the boy was not quite old enough to realize fully the great principles for which his mother had fought so long, and for which he deemed it proper to leave all the material comforts of a fine home, to earn her living and his. "This will be your room, Tom, and this will be Mother's. We'll have a combination dining room and kitchen, and the other room will have to be living room, parlor, and everything else. The furniture is not nearly so bad as I thought it would be. We'll improve on it from time to time. Now we must go out for a little lunch and then get to bed. It is getting very late." So out into the darkness of the night the two went in search of a place where they could get something to eat. The houses on either side seemed almost tenantless, if one could judge by the absence of lights in them. At the turn of a corner they came upon a few stores, in whose fly-specked windows yellowish lights cast their beams, upon gaudy colored dresses in one window, upon dingy-looking canned goods in the second, and upon scraggy pot plants in a third. The eyes of both mother and son were surveying these things when out of the latter doorway came a man and a woman. "Coffee was rotten tonight, Jack. Let's see if we can't find another joint tomorrow. What d'ya say?" "Suits me, kid. So long's we're paying for it, we might as well get." The remainder of the sentence did not reach the ears of Mrs. Blake. "Here's a place, Tom. Let's go in." So into the place whose coffee had been the theme of the two previous customers' remarks went Mrs. Blake and Tommy. The eating room was small and contained nothing but a lunch counter, 3 high stools, and a number of gaudy advertisements of such things as cigarettes and soft drinks. Behind the counter was a door which apparently gave entrance to a kitchen. It was now almost entirely blocked by the huge body of a woman in the act of retreating with an armful of dirty dishes. She turned when she heard the Blakes enter. "Evening, madam," grinned the woman in the doorway, and before Mrs. Blake could answer, she added, "Strangers, ain't ya? I'll be back in a minute." Mrs. Blake sat upon one of the stools and Tom upon another. The oilcloth on the counter had long since served its time, but where it still stretched in unbroken patches its surface was greasy from lack of hot water and soap. "Now what can I do for ya?" came from the door, and a moment later the same huge woman entered, wiping her hands on her dirty apron. "Mother'd like something to eat, and so would I," spoke up Tommy before his mother found words. "So you would," rejoined the waitress, her toothless mouth stretched in a cavernous grin. "Well, I have some nice coffee, some very nice sandwiches, strictly fresh eggs, and some delicious apple pie." So saying, she planted her plump hands upon her hips, threw back her head, and waited in heavy silence for the response to her sparkling adjectives. But it was hard for her to wait, and just as hard for Mrs. Blake to speak, because the surroundings so belied the promised menu. "Folks that just left are 2 of my best patrons. You're new here, ain't ya? I never seen such well-dressed folks in these parts." Then words came to Mrs. Blake. She was afraid questions might be asked which she would not care to answer, so she broke in upon the monologue. "Bring us 2 egg sandwiches, 2 cups of coffee, and 2 pieces of apple pie, please." At that the cook moved toward her kitchen, but turned again, stooping under the counter, and drawing forth an evening paper, placed it before Mrs. Blake. "See the news while I'm gone, missus." There was only one part of the paper that interested Louise that night, a part that had never interested her before, the classified ones. She scanned them hurriedly but accurately, fearing the while that she might be caught looking in that section. She still had the pride of family in her veins. Suddenly her eyes fell upon an advertisement for a clerk in a ladies' furnishings department. Making a hasty effort to pull one of her calling cards from the pack in her pocketbook, she tore the pasteboard in 2. She pulled out another, jotted down the address, slipped the card and pencil back into her purse, and was just reaching for the torn pieces which she had pushed aside, when the waitress entered with 2 large, heavy mugs of coffee. "Don't bother about them pieces, missus. Just throw them down here on the floor." And before Louise quite knew what was happening, the woman took the cardboard fragments from her fingers and tossed them under the counter. "Some cups they have here, Mother, aren't they?" "Yes, buddy, them's real mugs." And a moment later the waitress cook was before them with 2 glasses of water. "You see, it's mostly working men that come in here. They don't want no china." As she concluded her explanation, she gave Tommy a friendly pat on the arm. "I'll get your sandwiches now, folks. I'm sure they are ready." As the woman disappeared, Mrs. Blake took a sip of the coffee, which she found to be not quite so bad as she had feared. When the sandwiches arrived, Tommy fell upon his with some relish. He was young and hungry. But how different was tonight's lunch from last night's dinner! "What do you think of the coffee, ma'am? Folks say Katie Brown's good at it." "It's good, Mrs. Brown," Louise replied, only wishing that the mugs were a bit cleaner. Soon the lunch was over, and the two went back through the deserted, dimly lighted streets to the little cottage. "Tommy, I know you don't fully realize what this is all about. I don't want you to think less of your daddy than you did. I want you to pray to St. Joseph for him. If we had stayed on with him, you would have been put into that school Daddy spoke about, and you would undoubtedly have lost your faith and possibly your morals, and that I could never stand for. You don't, and never will, know all Mother has gone through, but—" Here Mrs. Blake began to lose control of her nerves and voice, for she thought it best to let matters stand for the present. "Let's go to bed now. It's quite late, and you are very tired after that long ride today. Tomorrow we can talk and plan." With that she went into Tom's bedroom and threw back the covers for him. Out of one of the suitcases she drew his night clothes and spread them upon his bed. A small metal statue of St. Joseph, given her by a sister in her college days, was placed upon a little table. Then the two knelt and together said their night prayers. At the moment it seemed as though this were the sole part of the past that had not changed, for even though that past was so near, the events of this day had borne no resemblance to it. While they thus knelt in prayer, Katie Brown, in her dingy restaurant, was piecing together the parts of the calling card she had been so careful to obtain from her new caller, although at the time she had seemed indifferent to it. When she succeeded in patching it together, she read it to herself: Mrs. Thomas Blake, 3965 Milton Boulevard, New York. To Katie, at that moment, the name on the card was only a name. She was satisfied to know who it was that had called at her place, dressed so much better than anyone else who had entered for months. For her restaurant was only a cheap coffee house, kept mainly for the convenience of the neighborhood factory employees. After she had read the card, Katie's first impulse was to destroy it. But on second thought she placed it upon a shelf at the rear of the counter and proceeded to clean up her place for the night. At 3965 Milton Boulevard, New York, a different scene was being enacted. When the maid, who had been given the half-day off, returned to the Blake mansion late that night and found the place empty, she at once knew that something unusual had happened. Never had Mrs. Blake been absent without leaving a note of explanation. The maid, Alice Clark, was a fine elderly Catholic woman with whom Louise had shared many of her trials and sorrows, and on whose broad bosom she had often cried when she could no longer bear her anguish. Where was her mistress tonight? This was what Alice was asking herself as the great hall clock struck 11. And what was she herself to do? Finally, what would stubborn Tom Blake do when he got back home that night or the following morning and found the pride of his life, Tom Jr., gone? Were only his wife absent, that would mean little to him. But Tommy! Alice dropped helplessly into one of the big, cushioned chairs to await the man of the house. She knew there was no use in going to bed, even if she had felt inclined to do so. As soon as Tom returned, he would, of course, do as he had always done, go to young Tom's room to assure himself that all was well, and then when he found him gone, he would probably wake up the whole neighborhood. The hours slowly crawled by, and just as the clock struck 2, the powerful lights of Blake's car flashed against the white doors of the garage. Alice arose from her chair, switched on the main light in the room, and nervously prepared to greet the master. As soon as the door opened and Tom Blake saw Alice, he seemed to sense something amiss. "Why are you up at this hour, Alice?" He was trying to act natural, but making a poor job of it. "Why, I'm waiting for Mrs. Blake," she faltered. "Is Tommy in bed?" "No, sir, he isn't." Blake rushed upstairs, clicking on every electric switch that he passed. Into Tommy's room he dashed, only to find it empty. Then on to Louise's room, empty too. He snatched up her telephone, dialed her father's home, and waited in a fever of impatience till the ringing was finally answered. No, Louise was not there. No, neither was Tommy. No, they could tell him nothing. He slammed down the phone, only to jerk it up again and call the chief of detectives, informing the official of the disappearance of his son and bidding him locate the boy without getting the case into the newspapers. Early the following morning, while detectives were warming to their job of tracing her and her son, Louise Blake, now known as Yvonne Bierce, was making her way to the downtown district of Lawson as applicant for the position she had seen advertised in the paper. She who had never known in her whole life what it was to do a day's work was now in search of a job. Her prayers were answered and her application was favorably passed upon by the management. From that day, business in the ladies' furnishings department of the Lawson department store began to pick up. Louise had very definite ideas on style and methods of advertising, and the charm of her personality was not lost on purchasers. Nearly a month slipped by. Life in the little home went on evenly. An elderly Catholic woman, Miss Shanahan, had been secured to attend to the house and prepare their meals. Tommy went every day to the parish school, where he was well liked by both pupils and teachers. He was a bright lad, and lessons came easy to him. But in spite of this, his mother insisted that he take his work seriously, that no one in the class be allowed to get higher marks. Fall faded into winter, Christmas came and went, and now the blustery winds began to soften into almost springtime gentleness. Easter was not very far away. The Lawson department store, ambitious from recent successes, resolved to show something special in the way of hats and dresses. So it was that Yvonne Bierce was asked to go to New York as the buyer for her department and trusted with full power to purchase as she thought best. When Louise was first asked to undertake the trip, she refused. She knew she would be running the risk of discovery, for she was certain her husband would be doing everything in his power to locate his son. In this certainty, of course, she was correct. More than once Tom Blake had come to fierce words with the chief of the detectives, but to no avail. The only reply he could get was that everything possible was being done. But Louise was finally prevailed upon to reconsider. The trip to New York was taken, and everything worked out well. She made some very shrewd purchases, and in general used her responsibility to the entire satisfaction of her employer. The night of her return, canvas covered the windows of the Lawson department store, and the evening papers carried a space-filling announcement of the coming style show under the direction of Madame Yvonne Bierce, famous New York stylist. This was out of the ordinary for Lawson, but the company owners had complete confidence in their department head. They expected a great turnout, and to prevent any theft in the anticipated crush, they actually hired 2 detectives. And there was a great turnout. What a day of business it was for the store, and what a day of triumph for the New York stylist. Before noon all Yvonne's smart goods were sold out. "Madame Bierce," said the proprietor, beaming, "never before has Lawson seen the like. You know, I have been doing some thinking. September 10th will be our 5th anniversary here. Now I know that sounds like a long way off, but I want you to begin making preparations for it." "I shall be glad to help you. I'll make my plans and then talk them over with you." The days wore on, and at last school closed for the summer. Louise made 2 more trips to New York, and everything worked out very well. September came all too soon to suit Tommy, but he soon got into the swing of his classes once more. For several days preceding the anniversary celebration at the Lawson department store, large advertisements appeared in the newspapers, and people talked excitedly about the coming event. Louise reached home every evening quite exhausted from her work, but September 10th came and went in a blaze of glory. The proprietor was delighted almost beyond speech by the success of all their plans. That night as Louise stepped onto a streetcar, an automobile containing 2 rather well-dressed men passed along very near it. There was nothing out of the ordinary about the happening, and Louise paid no attention to it. When the car stopped at the corner where she was accustomed to get off, the automobile was but slightly ahead of it. Louise walked down the little street in which she and Tommy lived, and was just stepping onto the lawn in front of her cottage when an automobile coming from the opposite end of the street drove past. The 2 men in it looked straight ahead, apparently not observing her, but she could not help noticing that it was the same car. The idea of being identified had been constantly in her mind ever since she had left New York, and now she was alarmed. However, she put the incident from her mind, engrossed as she was in the happiness of the day. "Oh, Mother, you're late tonight, aren't you?" It was Tommy jumping up to greet her. "Yes, Tommy, but today was a big day. Mother is to get a raise in salary and have much less work to do. Won't that be fine?" "And will we move into a better place then, like you said?" "Yes, Tommy, we must get a better place. You must grow up in a much better home than this. Soon you will be going to high school. You're getting to be a big boy now." After supper that night they talked over the unusual day at the Lawson department store, and when 9 o'clock came they went to bed, happy and contented. The following afternoon, about an hour after Tommy had returned from school, he went out on the front lawn to examine a little plot of ground in which he had planted tulip bulbs, and which he scrutinized daily, though he knew there would be no blooms before spring, when an automobile slowly drew up toward the curb and one of its occupants tooted the horn. Tommy looked up for a moment, but the car moved along in a leisurely fashion. Why had the horn been blown at him? He noticed that both men had been looking toward him. But they were gone now. The tulip bed once more claimed his attention. The next day as he was coming home from school, he passed Katie Brown's restaurant. Out in front of it, empty, stood an automobile like the one which had cruised past the night before. As soon as Tommy recognized it, his mind turned from it to the men he felt sure were in eating at Katie's greasy counter. Through his memory then passed the events of that first strange night in Lawson. But the boy walked on home, presently thinking of other things. Fall was in the air, the odor of autumn leaves was apparent. He approached his tulip bed for the daily visit. However, he had barely stooped over it when the car drove past again, just as it had done the night before. Tommy became definitely suspicious. He went into the house and told the cook what had happened. She in turn called Louise's attention to it that evening. Louise immediately felt alarmed. Had Katie told the two men about the Blakes? Had she kept the torn calling card all this time? "Don't come home by way of Katy Street tomorrow afternoon, Tommy," said his mother in troubled tones. "And when you get home, don't go out on the lawn. Watch from behind the curtains in the front room and see if that car comes past again. I'm afraid something is up." End of chapter 1.